Hello my friends, welcome to another knowledge lesson. Today we are going to be starting a whole new knowledge unit. We just finished up talking about insects. This unit will be talking about the Civil War, which is a war that the United States fought. We talked about one war already, the War of 1812. Before we talked about the War of 1812, we talked just a little bit about the Revolutionary War. Remember, during the Revolutionary War, the colonists decided to fight Great Britain in order to gain their own freedom. They wanted freedom from Great Britain. And they earned it through the Revolutionary War. But they didn't share that freedom with everyone. In our Pledge of Allegiance, we say that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But for a long time in the United States, there wasn't actually liberty and justice for all, only for some people. For a long time, people in the United States kept that freedom and that justice from African American people. And that's what we're going to talk about a lot in this unit. Back when America first started, right after the Revolutionary War, the United States participated in slavery. Lots of places have participated in slavery throughout the history of the world. And we recognize now that it is a terrible and evil practice. Enslaved people or slaves are people who are forced to do work for no wages or pay, and they are not allowed to make their own decisions about where to live or what to do with their lives. Enslaved people were often not treated very kindly by those that owned them. In this period of history that we're going to be talking about, this happened shortly after westward expansion in the United States. So remember, the United States was growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger. But we still had a problem with slavery. Many people in this time knew that slavery was wrong. But many of the colonies, especially those in the southern United States, still forced people into slavery. We are going to learn in the next several weeks that people in different parts of the country strongly disagreed about slavery as the United States continued to grow and spread westward. Slavery was allowed in some states, especially in the South, but not in others. Having different parts of the United States disagree about whether or not slavery should be allowed eventually led to a full war. Unlike the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War, the United States wasn't fighting against another country, but fighting against itself. We were fighting with each other about this disagreement. That's why it's called a civil war. If there is a disagreement between two different groups of people in one community, one country, it is a civil war. Today, our read aloud today isn't going to be about the war itself, but about a very important and very special woman who was one of my heroes. Her name was Harriet Tubman. As a child, she had the nickname Minty, so she'll be called Minty a lot in our read aloud today. In the read aloud, we will hear her mostly called Minty. Harriet Tubman lived and worked before, during, and after the time of the Civil War. We'll talk about her in our next two lessons. Today we'll mostly focus about her childhood. She was born into slavery. And then later, in our next lesson, we'll talk more about what she did later in life and why she's one of my heroes. Before we start today, friends, learning about Miss Harriet Tubman, I'm going to go over our vocabulary words. Before we begin our story, let's go over a few of the vocabulary words that we will hear. The first word is value. The value of something is its usefulness or importance. If a car drives well in the snow, it would have great value during winter months. A painting done by a very famous artist would also have a lot of value.
but a broken pencil probably wouldn't have very much value. Take a minute to think of something that has lots of value to you. Slavery. Slavery is the practice of forcing people to work without pay as enslaved people and denying them the freedom to decide how to live their lives. Slavery was very unfair, since all people should have the right to be paid for their work and be free to decide where to work and live. Plantations. Plantations are large farms where crops are grown. There were many large cotton plantations in the South before the Civil War. Wages. Wages is money that is paid or received for work. For example, enslaved people were forced to do difficult work for no wages. Survival. Survival is the ability to continue to live or exist, especially when it is difficult to do so. For example, a polar bear relies on layers of fur for its survival in very cold habitats. Minty's eyelids were heavy. Her head bobbed up and down as she faded in and out of sleep. She pinched herself to try to stay awake, but the house was so quiet and calm. Even the tree frogs, crickets, and other creatures of the night had stopped their chirping and croaking. It seemed that all of Maryland was asleep at this late hour, except young Minty. At age 6, Minty should have been asleep too. Her body and mind cried out for sleep, yet she dared not doze off for fear that she would not hear the baby crying. The baby was Minty's responsibility. She watched over the baby day and night, rocked him to sleep, kept him warm in his blanket, and sang songs to keep him happy. Minty would do anything in her power to keep him happy, for she knew that if he cried, she would be punished. And so, each time the baby stirred in his crib, each time he whimpered or moaned, Minty's heart raced. As soon as the baby cried out, even if he only cried for a moment, the baby's mother would get very angry with Minty. Do you think it was fair for the baby's mother to get angry with Minty when her baby cried? Can Minty always control when babies cry? Those of you that have younger siblings probably know that babies cry all the time, sometimes for no reason. This was the awful, painful reality in which Minty lived, because Minty was an enslaved African person. Even at the tender age of 6 years old, she was forced to work for no pay all day long, every day. And Minty thought she would be enslaved her entire life until she died. This was the terrible truth of slavery. Minty and other enslaved Africans like her had no rights or freedom. Minty would be forced to do the hard work given to her from sunup to sundown, providing great value to the plantation owner almost every day of her entire life. So remember, value means something that's useful or important. Very, very little of Minty's time would ever be her own to do with as she wished. This is what life was like for millions of people in the United States of America when Minty was 6. In fact, this is what life had been like for many people for a long time, long before Minty or her parents and even her grandparents were born. One night, Minty asked her mother how and why she and her family had become enslaved. Well, your grandmother, her mother told her, she came over the ocean on a great big ship. She came from a place called Africa. Many Africans are here now, enslaved in this land they call the United States. Why did grandmother and other Africans come here? Minty asked. It was not their choice to come here from Africa, her mother explained. Africans were captured by men with guns and other weapons who wanted to bring them to America to work in slavery. They were put on these ships against their will, and then they were brought to this country and sent to places like plantations, farms, businesses, or households to work. Remember, a plantation is a very large farm where specific crops are grown. That's why our life is the way it is. We do as we are told, and we do our best to survive. By this, Minty's mother meant they worked hard to keep their families as safe and as healthy as possible. Slavery is a terrible thing that has been used by many different groups of people throughout history, going back thousands of years ago. Minty's father and mother had 9 children, including Minty. But, like most enslaved Africans, the family did not live or work together all in one home. Minty's mother worked for a man named Edward Broadus. Minty's father worked for a man named Edward Thompson, whose plantation was down the road from the Broadus home. 3 of Minty's sisters were sent away to work for plantation owners in Georgia. Minty never saw any of them again. As her mother said, enslaved people did not have a choice or say in the matter. The plantation owners did whatever they had to do to make as much money as possible from their plantations and slave labor. Remember, enslaved people were not paid for their hard work. Since enslaved people were not paid, plantation owners, small farmers, business owners, and others who used slaves made more money than they would have if they had to pay people to do the work. Because families of enslaved Africans often could not live together or were separated, they depended on the community of the enslaved Africans on the plantation. Mothers and fathers would take care of children who were not their own. Enslaved Africans helped and supported each other as communities by looking out for each other and working together. In this way, they could be strong together, despite the fact that they were enslaved. Although life was hard for the enslaved people, this working together and helping each other contributed to their survival and made it better. So remember, survival means to keep living even when it's hard. Survival was definitely hard for these enslaved people, but they kept going. Where Minty lived, the enslaved Africans worked hard to perform many jobs that added value to the plantation. They took care of the horses and tended crops of tobacco, corn, and hay, plowing, planting, and harvesting. In the winter, they chopped wood, mended fences, and helped clear more land for farming. Many enslaved people were skilled at a trade. Some tended to the farm animals, and butchers preserved the meat. Weavers, spinners, and seamstresses were involved in the process of making clothing. Their skills were valued. Skilled carpenters constructed and repaired buildings and made furniture, and blacksmiths used iron to make and mend important tools for the life and work of the plantation. Many lived in shacks with dirt floors, had one set of tattered clothes and no shoes, and didn't have enough to eat. Most enslaved Africans worked out in the fields, performing the many difficult tasks involved in growing and harvesting the crops. They were known as field slaves, and they lived the hardest lives of all. They worked from early morning until late at night, often with no relief from the heat or rest from their hard labor. They always worked under the watchful eye of the overseers, people who kept watch over and directed the enslaved people. The enslaved people always worked under the threat of punishment. Other enslaved Africans worked in what was known as the Big House, the beautiful mansion belonging to the plantation owners. They did not have to work in the hot sun. They wore nicer clothes than the field slaves, and they sometimes had access to more food than the field slaves. In addition to daily cooking and cleaning, house slaves helped make butter. wash the household laundry, and care for the plantation owner's young children. That was Minty's job, which was why she was watching the baby at night. Just like those who worked in the fields, enslaved Africans who worked in the house worked hard. But, also like the people who worked in the fields, they helped each other a lot, and that made it less hard and less sad. Plantations, like the one where Minty and other enslaved Africans lived and worked, were common throughout Maryland and all of the states in the southern United States, or the South. The South, spelled with a capital S because it's a proper noun, we're naming a specific place. The South had rich soil and endless farmland. Those who owned the land could get rich by growing and selling tobacco, cotton, and other crops. Running a large plantation required many workers. There were no tractors or other machines to help in those days. The enslaved Africans working on a plantation contributed valuable skills and labor to the success of the plantation. Without the enslaved Africans, the plantation could not be run. They did many important jobs of all kinds. Even so, rather than hiring workers and paying them, plantation owners, who were white, forced people who were black to work for free in a life of slavery. The plantation owners thought that they could treat these African people this way because they looked different. Because of this difference in the way they looked, the plantation owners thought that they were better than the people they enslaved, even though that's not true. As enslaved people, they were not given any wages for the work they did on the plantations. Remember, wages means the money earned for doing work. Enslaved Africans were not given wages of any kind. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to live a life in slavery. And the children of the enslaved Africans, children like Minty and her sisters and brothers, automatically became enslaved the very moment they were born. They would likely remain enslaved until they died. As Minty's mother explained, enslaved people did not have the choice to be free people. Or did they? Early on, Minty began to wonder whether it was possible to resist or fight back as an enslaved person. She wondered this because she had, in fact, seen her own mother resist the plantation owner's wishes. When Minty was young, Mr. Broadus arranged to send her brother Moses to a plantation belonging to another owner. Minty's mother had already seen 3 of her daughters sent far away to another plantation down south, and she was determined not to lose any more of her children. When Mr. Broadus came to fetch Moses to send him away with the other plantation owner, Minty's mother stood in the doorway and promised, "I will not allow any more of my children to be taken away." Something in her eyes must have scared Mr. Broadus that day, because he turned around and he never tried to send Moses or anyone else in Minty's family away again. This event gave Minty a shred of hope that one day she might be able to fight back and possibly win her freedom. Do you think that Minty will eventually be able to be free?
Alright, my friends, as always, I've got some questions for you about what we learned about today. Today we read about a girl named Minty, but that was just a nickname. What was Minty's real name? You've got it. Her name was Harriet Tubman. Remember, as an enslaved person, Harriet Tubman had no rights, she had to work for no money, and she did not have a say in how her life went or where she lived. Today, in this read aloud, we learned a little bit about slavery in the United States and how it worked just a little bit. What continent did most enslaved people come from? Most enslaved people in the early stages of the United States came from the continent Africa. So we've got the United States right here in yellow on our map. Most of the enslaved people that were brought to America were taken from their homes on the continent Africa. We can see it right here. It's got all of those colorful countries on it. What type of work did the enslaved African people have to do on the fields? On the fields, they were in charge of plowing, planting, and harvesting the crops. What kind of work did enslaved people do in the big house? Enslaved people that worked in the big house were in charge of cooking, cleaning, laundry, and taking care of young children. What other jobs did enslaved African Americans perform on a plantation? There are lots of other things that enslaved people did. There were carpenters and blacksmiths and seamstresses. There were people who chopped wood or mended fences, people that cleared land for farming, people that tended the animals, people that butchered them and took care of the meat. Lots of different things. What was life like for those enslaved people? Was it a very easy life? No. Life for those enslaved people was very hard. What was done to them and the way they were treated was horrible, and they worked in terrible conditions. Why were slaves like Minty and her family important to plantation owners in the South? Remember, plantation owners in the South depended on slavery. Why was that? Plantations were very, very big, and so they needed lots of workers to take care of all of the jobs that are on a plantation that took a lot of skill or talent. The enslaved people were forced to do work without being paid any wages, and the plantation owners chose to treat them this way because they looked different. Remember, the only reason people treated slaves this way was because they looked different from them, and they thought that somehow that made them less important or less human, less people, which of course we know is absolutely not true today. But they were treated really badly, and they weren't given pay. So the plantation owners did not lose money, but they got all of the work done that they needed to get done. All right, my friends, we are going to finish Minty or Harriet Tubman's story in our lesson tomorrow. For now, I want you to open up the PDF that's attached to this assignment, and I'm going to jump on my computer to show you what to do.
The first page on the PDF that's attached to this assignment should look like this. This is a T-chart, called a T-chart because it's shaped like a T, and it's used to help us compare two different things. Today we'll be comparing slavery and freedom. We learned a little bit about slavery today and about what life was like for enslaved people. Think about Minty and what we learned about her life as a child. Under slavery, was her life an easy life? No. Slavery made life very difficult or very hard and very painful. I'm going to say difficult and painful life. Go ahead and fill in this chart along with me as we're talking about it. What else could we say about slavery? enslaved people often had to do a lot of very difficult jobs that required a lot of skill. And did they get paid for all of that hard work they did and for all of the jobs that they did? No, they didn't receive any money or any pay for the work they did. So they were forced to work for free without getting paid. Did plantation owners usually treat the enslaved people that they owned very well? No, they were often treated very poorly. They often had to live and work in horrible conditions. Did enslaved people like Minty get to make their own decisions about their lives? Most of their decisions were made for them. They didn't have a lot of choice about where they lived or worked, or what they did every day, or what people they got to see. They had most of those choices taken away from them. For the most part, they had no choices. Those enslaved people were often taken from their homes and their families. Ooh, I made the same mistake. There we go. Going too fast. I think it would be really difficult for me if I were separated from my family. But oftentimes they were split up and their families would go to different plantations and work in different places. Because they were forcibly removed from their families and separated, they would form very strong bonds and relationships with other enslaved people on the plantation or homes that they worked in. They formed these bonds in an attempt to make their life a little bit less sad and maybe a little bit less difficult. But it was still very hard. Even with those friendships and those strong relationships, their life was still very difficult and very painful, and they were not treated fairly at all. What about freedom? If you have freedom, I know I'm moving pretty fast. I'm actually going to pause for a little bit. If you would like to add anything else that you've learned about slavery, go ahead and pause the video and do so now. When you are ready to add to the freedom column, go ahead and hit resume or play on the video again. All right, my friends, freedom. When you have freedom, do you lead a difficult and painful life? You might have some difficulties or painful things in your life, but none of them would be caused by you not having the freedom to make your own choices. That's another big one with freedom. If you are free, do you get to choose where you go every day, or what you wear, or who you talk to, or what your job is? Yes. If you are freedom, you get to make your own choices about your own life. If you have freedom, when you get a job, do you get paid for the jobs you choose to take? Yes. If you choose to work, you will be paid. Are you treated very poorly? If you don't have anyone that owns you, you don't have to worry about how you're being treated by those people. You don't have to worry about being taken from your home or your family. You have the freedom to stay there if you would like to. Most of our good things about freedom are about choices. That is the biggest difference between freedom and slavery. Is that when you have freedom, you are free to make choices. You can choose to stay with your family. You can choose jobs that you actually enjoy, where you will get paid for your work. You can choose to incorporate things in your life that will make you happy, or people in your life that will treat you well. See if you can think about some other good things about freedom, or things about freedom that you get to enjoy in your own life. Go ahead and pause this video while you finish filling out this chart. When you are ready for the next part of our assignment, scroll down to the next page and hit play again. All right, my friends, our next part is a journal entry. Just like with our insect journals, we are going to be keeping a journal to help us remember everything that we're learning about the Civil War. Today's journal entry is going to be about what we learned today about Harriet Tubman's early life. Some things that you might want to include in your journal entry. Your journal entry, before I start with what should be included, should be 3 to 5 complete sentences. That means that you start with a capital, you end with some kind of final punctuation, a period, an exclamation mark, or a question mark, and you have both a subject and a predicate. In those 3 sentences, I want you to tell me what you remember about Minty's life. So you have 2 pages if you need the extra room. Some things that you might want to talk about in your journal did Minty work in the fields or in the big house? Did she work in the fields or in the big house? What were some of her jobs? What are some of the things that she had to do or that she was responsible for? What was her family like? What do we know about her parents or her siblings? What were they like? Did all of Minty's siblings live and work on the same plantation that she did? What else? What else do you remember about Minty? These are just some ideas to help you get those creative juices flowing and think about what else you could write about Miss Minty. When you have got at least 3 to 5 complete sentences in your journal entry, go ahead back to this front page and draw a picture in the box. That will help you remember what we learned today. If I were you, I would probably draw a picture of Minty. All right, my friends, when you are finished with that second part, you are all done with knowledge today. There is a couple more pages at the bottom. This is a letter for your parents or guardians to let them know what we are going to be learning about in the next couple of weeks. When you have that assignment, go ahead and turn that assignment in when you are done, friends, and I will see you next time.